everyone, this is Lindsey with Lindsey's Craft Studio. It may not look like I'm here, but I am. And today we are going to be doing some watercolor card making. Thank you for being interested in this tutorial. As always, it's always a pleasure to bring new crafting experiences to everyone that I work with. So today's craft is this guy. So as you can see, there's some nice luminosity with the watercolor paint, but when I tell you this really only takes 5 or 10 minutes once you actually start painting, you wouldn't believe it. It looks so pretty. All the different colors in the Black-Eyed Susans and our gladiolas up there. I had intended for them to be lilacs, but they came out really big. So the good thing about lilacs and gladiolas being so similar is that you could really call them either or and nobody would know the difference. But those are definitely Black-Eyed Susans down below. So we are going to get started. So what you need, what I usually use for paper, I usually use this all-purpose stuff. I know some people who do watercolor are really particular about their supplies, but I like this because it's readily available and a lot of it comes in a notebook, and it's just the right weight for me to become a card without being too stiff. I don't like working on cardstock because sometimes it gets a little bit grainy during the wetting and stretching process. Now, what I mean by that is when you use all-purpose paper that is not intended for watercolor use, you can use it for watercolor, but what you need to do first is you need to soak the paper completely, tape it to a board. I've used just a wood board canvas for this, but you could use a cutting board or the back of a notebook, something where that tape is not going to come off at all. And what happens is as this paper dries out completely, ideally overnight or in about 20 minutes if you choose to use a blow dryer to expedite the process, the fibers of the paper will stretch and then they will kind of set where they are with some space between them. And the reason that's important is because all of you have experienced this. If you've painted on a piece of paper before, sometimes it will wrinkle. And if you're giving this to someone as a card, as a gift, you don't want it to be kind of messy looking and wrinkled. You want it to be nice and flat. So the stretching process is important because it lets those paper fibers come to a resting state where they're further apart from one another, and then the paint can settle in between and it won't warp them. So just a little bit of science for you before we begin. So I have actually done that process already. These pieces of paper dried overnight. I have the one that we'll be working on, and then I actually have another hummingbird one that I'm going to be experimenting with later on, probably after this tutorial. So if you don't already follow me on social media, make sure that you do so you can see how it comes out. The other cool thing that you are going to need for this activity, you'll need a set of watercolors. So these actually came engraved for me from this company. I actually purchased them a while ago, and my watercolors are actually on pieces of paper. And the reason I like this brand is because once this is wet, it dries in about 30 seconds. So if I need to get up quickly from what I'm doing and close this and throw it into a bag, these are really good portable watercolors. So this is something that, if you're in line at a theme park or you are traveling somewhere, or even if you're on your lunch break someplace where you don't have access to water, you can use these. So these are the watercolors that I use. Your regular average watercolor set will work just fine. So if you have watercolor paint pots that are like square or round and they have a lot of pigment and you have to add water and use them on a desk, that's fine too. It all works just okay. I also have this limited edition spring set of these, and these are so bright, and the cool thing about them is at the end here they have metallics. So the metallic paints, I will say, if this were an official review of this company, which it is not because they're not endorsing me in any way, I would say that they don't actually work as well as they say that they do, but they still add a nice touch. So if you can find metallic watercolors and you want to experiment with them, you can, or you could use some metallic paint to augment this. But this card by itself was just regular watercolor colors, no metallics at all. My last little piece of advice, I love a water fill pen. I'm not sure if you can see the little bubble going back and forth in the handle. They sell these in the watercolor aisle at your regular craft store. I have had this pen for several years. It's kind of beat up, but it still works just fine. And they sell them in different sizes so that you can hold more water. They're different shapes, so they're more ergonomic for your hand. And this one, the bristles are a little bit frayed, even though they still work just fine for me. If you want a nicer point on your brush, they certainly do sell them. They sell very fine point, and they sell ones that are wide if you're doing a lot of landscape painting. But this size and shape brush works just well for me. And what this does is it ensures that I don't have to constantly dip for water, because I can just squeeze and get the water to come out the end, which is pretty neat. So I want to say they're only a couple of bucks, it can't be more than $2 in a store, because they are meant to be used multiple times. So it's just like buying a set of regular brushes, except this one is used with water in it for watercolor. So pretty neat. You could absolutely do this with regular brushes. If you were going to do this with a regular brush, I would suggest something medium, and then I would also suggest something that's a little small. So that's why I have those brushes there for an example. So for today's activity, you are going to want to sketch out the image that is pictured here before you begin. So I'm going to hold this up to my camera so you can see it. My watercolor pen dripped here a little bit. So we have 3 gladiolas or lilacs in the back, whatever you prefer to call them. And I have 5 black-eyed Susans. Now, the reason I sketch things out with watercolor before beginning to paint is because watercolor is one of those activities where you do have to plan a little bit. It can get really easy to get carried away. If you're a more advanced watercolor painter, most people don't outline things before they paint them because it will always show up on your finished card. But as long as your paint doesn't spill too far over the lines, I think it gives it a really interesting rustic quality, and it definitely looks handmade, and that's the goal that we're going for here. We're going for handmade. Handmade with love. So as far as colors go, now that you have this sketched out onto your completely dry surface, some people like to work on watercolor while the paper underneath is still wet. And if you like watercolor that is really runny and doesn't hold a shape and it kind of blends into itself, it's definitely a softer look. But for this card, the paper underneath was completely dry. So you can go ahead and pause this video and give your paper time to dry, or try again tomorrow if needed, if your paper is still wet. And once you are dry, I'm just going to check to make sure that those spots that dripped are also dry, because that affects everything. And this is why we always keep plenty of clean paper towels on hand. There we go. Perfect. Nice and dry. Okay. So now we have to choose our colors, which is always the fun part. So this spring booklet actually doesn't have a nice purple in it, which was an interesting choice. It's got this kind of magenta-ish color, and it's got some blues, but it doesn't really have a purple in it. So I think I'm going to go back to my OG colors, and I'm going to choose something that is like a nice violet color. Now, this looks green on camera. I realize it does. It's very, very metallic and super pigmented because of this company. But this is the color swatch down below. So your set of watercolors, you want to choose something that's kind of this color. And if you want to, you can absolutely mix and match. One of the beautiful things about watercolor is that it layers very nicely. So with this type of flower, sometimes they do have a little bit of blue to them. So if you wanted to, you could start off with violet and add a little bit of blue in. And then if the color's too bright, you can always add more water to mute it. But personally, I like the concentrated violet myself. So I'm going to hold my palette of color here, and I'm going to hold my brush in my right hand so you can see what I'm doing as I'm doing it. And I'm going to load up my brush with color so that it's going to be very, very pigmented. So I'm not squeezing. There's very little water on this brush. So if you are working with standard watercolors, make sure that there's very little water on your brush so you get a lot of pigment. I'm sure you can see it there, that it's really full, even though it didn't focus. So anytime you're layering things that are the same color that are right next to each other with watercolor, you want to make sure that you start with something that needs time to dry, because by the time you complete the rest of this shape, this side will be dry and you'll be able to move on. So watercolor does involve a little bit of skipping around in the painting. We've all experienced having something still be wet and you paint something next to it and the color runs right into it and then you get a smudge that you weren't expecting. So this is going to prevent that a little bit. So for this type of flower, you're going to gently lay down some brush strokes of color, and I kind of make mine very random. And you're going to head to the left of this gladiola that we have. And the reason we're doing that is because as the pigment comes off of your brush, it's going to get lighter in color as you head to the left there. And that's the effect that we want. We want this part of our flower to be the darkest, where the most pigment is. So anytime you're painting with watercolor, you want to make sure that the darkest part is what you start with and the lightest part is what you end with. And if it's not quite light enough along this edge, if all your colors are starting to look the same, what you can do, this is one of my favorite techniques, is you can take a clean piece of paper towel and you are going to blot along the edge that you want to be a little bit lighter. And it will kind of pick up some of the color. You know, if I hadn't talked so much and it was still wet, it would have picked up some of the color. So let's see if we can do this second one a little bit more quickly. And then maybe you'll believe what I say is true. All right, so here's our dark values, moving very quickly to fill them in. Just dotting and blotting here. I'm going to squeeze so that I get a little bit more water on my brush. And I'm actually going to add even more dark color in here so that it's really, really dark, leaving some white spaces between because this type of flower does have those. And then while your edges are still wet, you're going to blot with your paper towel and gently lift away, and it will remove some of the color. Now you can see, and that's what kind of gives those two-tone effect. So you can really see if you look at this one up close, this whole inside line was left wet, and this I blotted with a paper towel, so it kind of sucks the pigment out of the watercolor. So if you ever have something that's too dark while it's still white, you can always fix it with that method. So just something that I thought might be interesting for you to know. So the reason I started with the outside two gladiolas is because the edge of this inside gladiola is already dry. So I'm actually able to go back in and do this middle flower now without having to wait for very long. So I'm going to start in the center of this one, just like dotting and squiggling. And then as I head toward the edge, I'm going to add more water so that I get a lighter color. And if needed, you can blot along the edge to make it even lighter so that it really stands out from the one next to it. This is why we always have clean paper towels on hand. So now if you wanted to change the color of these, if you wanted to add anything else to them, I think I'm going to change the shape of this one a little bit. It needs to be a little bit wider. Same thing down here, fix the shape. You could add another layer of blue, and those colors would sit over the colors you've already done. But I like to stop here at this point because part of the white showing through on this card is intentional. So try to leave it kind of sketchy and ethereal looking. That's the goal with this particular card. So if you're using the type of brush that I'm using, this is another really cool part. To rinse your brush, you're going to squeeze until you don't have any more color coming out of the brush. And then you're clean. Even though it looks like it still has stuff on the tip, it doesn't. It's clean. The water's clean. I can now use yellow to my heart's content. So the yellow that I used for this painting is actually in my other booklet, but I do have some yellows in this, and those come out very golds, and this one comes out very orange. So I think I'm going to choose a yellow that's a little bit brighter. And for that, I want this happy yellow. So that's what I'm going to use for my Black-Eyed Susans here. So same thing, we're loading up very, very pigmented. And we're going to do the outside edge of all of our flowers first. So we're just filling in our petals. And then very carefully, while your flower is still wet, I like to rip off a little piece of paper towel for this because it's such a small shape. You are going to take and suck some of the pigment out of the center so that you get an area that looks like it's a little bit lighter. So that's just a great way to make it look like your flowers are multi-dimensional and like you spent very long making sure that they had all the light and dark shades without actually having to do it. So just a little cheat. Expert level watercolor painters call that creating a thirsty brush. Anytime you're sucking pigment or water off of the top of a surface of a watercolor painting, you're creating a void and the ink is going to flow toward the void. So something good to know. I'm going to do the same thing to this flower. The other thing that it does, pressing right in the center there, is it prevents any water from pooling there so that by the time we get to the end of our flowers, we should be able to do the center of our Black-Eyed Susans just fine. And as usual, we are getting a visit from the studio cat, who is very interested in everything that I do at all times. So especially because we know we're going to be using such a dark color for the outside, it doesn't really matter if you run over your centers because the brown will definitely cover that up. And as usual, you absolutely could use different colors on these if you wanted to. You could augment them with a little bit of orange. Sometimes Black-Eyed Susans lean more on the orange side than true yellow. I personally think the yellow looks wonderful with the purple. I'm going to make sure I have a ton on here for this one. My favorite thing about working on dry paper with watercolor is, these flowers aren't bleeding anywhere I don't want them to. I'm a very controlled type of painter, which is why I don't usually work in watercolor too often. I like acrylic because you can cover up any mistakes that you make. With watercolor, it's very hard to go back. But with this particular card, there aren't very many mistakes to be made because we kind of move through this slowly and there's not a lot of detail. This is a very simple one. This tree bark brown is the color that I used for the center of my Black-Eyed Susans. I just thought they looked nice together. So I'm going to go back to my first flower, which I know is dry by now, and very carefully put in the little oval face for the Black-Eyed Susan. And I'm not going to forget to reload. I want to make sure that they stay nice and dark. Tiny smiley faces. Now there is such a thing as black watercolor. So if you wanted to do a second layer, since Black-Eyed Susans kind of have that brown and black mixture in the middle of them, you could do another layer, but I personally like the simple effect on the eye of just having the one color there. And last but not least, we are going to need some green. So this olive green color is the color that I chose for my stems. But you could use a bunch of different greens if you wanted to. So we're not going to touch this to any areas that we think may still be wet. We're just going to fill in places that are definitely dry so we don't accidentally smudge anything that we don't want to smudge. That's how you avoid bleeding in watercolor, is by skipping around and only putting your watercolor places that you know is dry on dry paper. So there we go. So there is our 5 or 10 minute sunflower. Oh, sunflower. Don't mind me. I'm looking at the sunflowers that are actually in my room. I actually just did a sunflower paper folding class. So if you didn't see that one go by, definitely keep an eye out for it. And that's why I said sunflower. Our black-eyed Susans and our gladiolas are all painted. So this is the finished product up close. And as you can see, we've got some nice luminosity in the flowers. They're all a little bit of a different shade of yellow, which is perfect. And our gladiolas are very pretty. If you wanted to, you could wait for this to dry completely, and you could try and go back in between the flowers with a little bit of green to make it look like they're growing out of a bed of grass. However, I like the look of having this much white space on this card. It was intentional, but that doesn't mean that you can't play around with the design. So the next step is very, very carefully removing any tape that you have from your card, if it's dry enough to do so. There we go. Careful, careful. And then eventually you will be able to pick up your card and fold it in half. Now, I always pre-fold my cards before I do any kind of work with them, because I like to know exactly where the center is when I'm drawing my design. And that way you don't make any mistakes with the orientation and accidentally put your design somewhere that's going to wind up on the back. So we are going to carefully extricate this card here. So the tape that I used is truthfully not the best tape for this activity. It's just what I had on hand. Once upon a time, Oliver had a little broken leg, so we bought mass quantities of bandage tape because it was something that wouldn't hurt his skin while we taped down the top of his cast, because he was a nibbler. So that is why I have bandage tape on my card here. You could use painter's tape. You could use, I wouldn't necessarily recommend Scotch tape unless it's the removable kind, because it would definitely tear your paper. Like, I think this side of my paper is going to tear no matter what I do. No, it's coming away just fine. Just a little patience. That's all it takes. That little piece has a little damage, but that's okay. This was my example. So definitely use paper safe tape when you are doing this at home. And here is our finished product, and most importantly, it is still nice and flat, which is the goal. So once you fold this over, you should have a copy of this card. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. I will definitely have more. So make sure that you follow me on Instagram. Make sure that you like me on Facebook. I'm also on TikTok, and every once in a while there are some fun videos of me or Oliver and our behind the scenes craft life. And as always, this is Lindsey's Craft Studio signing off. So thank you very much for crafting with me, and I hope to see you at another tutorial very, very soon.